Let us take a look at the inputs of develop schedule. We have the enterprise environmental factor coming as an input and the resource breakdown structure. We said after identifying the activities and the resource requirement for the activities, we get a resource breakdown structure. So that becomes an input for develop schedule. The project staff assignments, how many people are required or available / required for every task. The resource calendars, like this gives us the details about the availability of the resources, like the leave plans, the preventive maintenance schedules, and how many of the key resources are already blocked and their release plans from other projects. So all these things we get from the resource calendar. The activity list also comes as an input, and the project scope statement is an input. Risk register is an input. Project schedule network diagrams. We discussed about AOA, AON and all. So these network diagrams after activity sequencing, so that becomes an input. Organizational process assets. It could be the templates, the knowledge repository. It could be anything of that sort. And activity duration estimates, activity resource requirements, activity attributes, and the schedule management plan. So all these act as a input for develop schedule. Now the next one, so we saw the inputs. Now let us see the tools and techniques. We're talking about, we already spoke about leads and lags. We already spoke about leads and lags. A lead is primarily, we are talking about parallelism, whereas a lag is waiting time. Then schedule compression techniques, like we already spoke about fast tracking, crashing, crash cost, and I'll be explaining it again as well. Then resource optimization techniques, again crashing, fast tracking, resource leveling also. Resource leveling is also a resource optimization technique where we ensure that all the resources are loaded equally. Then we have the scheduling tools like maybe MS Project or Primavera or stuff like that. Then modeling techniques like activity on arrow, activity on node. Then the critical path method, which we'll see in detail during the Skype session. Like first we do a forward pass and calculate the early start and the early finish. Then we do a backward pass and calculate the late start and late finish. And float is equal to late start minus early start or late finish minus early finish. And when you connect all the activities whose float is equal to 0, we get the critical path. That means activities on the critical path will have 0 float. Then Goldratt has come out with something like critical chain method. So here in the critical chain, what it says is, if you take a snapshot of the schedule, let's say in week 1, multiple tasks are there, So this is done by resource 1, this is done by 2, this is done by 1, this is also done by 1, this is by 2, this is by 3, this is also 1. So what it's saying is, in week 1, if something happens to this resource 1, and if you don't have a backup plan for that, then your schedule will go for a toss. So always create backup plans for the critical chain of resources. So that is something he is advocating. So we call it as the critical chain of resources, because if the critical chain of resources, something happens to that during project execution, then even our critical path will go for a toss. So we discussed about the inputs for develop schedule, the tools and techniques for develop schedule, and now let us see the output for develop schedule. So here are the outputs. So we have the schedule baseline as an output, and we have the project schedule and updated project calendars, because once the schedule is done, once the resources are locked, we have to update the project calendars and the schedule data. So the details on which the schedule is based, the schedule data is also an output. And while doing the schedule, we might have updated the project management plan. So those also become an output. The key output of develop schedule is the schedule itself and the schedule baseline. A project can have multiple schedule baselines. So every day we don't baseline, so periodically we baseline. So the project schedule comes out, and then maybe baseline 1 happens, and multiple revisions to the schedule happens, and at some point in time one more baseline happens. So every version of the schedule is not considered as a baseline. So that is why we have two things here, project schedule and project baseline. So we discussed about the inputs for a developed schedule, and we discussed about the tools and techniques for developed schedule, and we discussed about the outputs as well for project schedule. Now I request you to go to the respective pages of PMBOK and read, so that we can have a meaningful discussion when you come back for the Skype meeting. Thank you very much.